For a patrol officer, the job is defined by a repetitive rhythm. Most nights are spent cycling through the same domestic disputes, noise complaints, and traffic stops that eventually blur into a single, indistinguishable career. Officers develop a psychological callus to manage this constant exposure. This mental defense mechanism allows them to witness tragedy and then transition to the next call without the emotional weight of the previous one. Yet, most veteran officers carry the memory of a single dispatch call that remained lodged in their mind. This specific event cuts through their training, leaving an impression that no amount of routine can smooth over. This diagram outlines 3 psychological triggers causing a call to haunt an officer's career. These pillars, the unexplainable, the depraved, and the unresolved, bypass standard mental defenses. Trauma rarely stems from physical danger alone. The psychological shock of breaking expected reality is more lasting. A veteran canine handler and his partner, a 4-year-old German Shepherd named Rex, were once called to assist in a house search after a foot pursuit. The property was a standard 2-story home, and by all accounts, the suspect was trapped inside. Rex moved through the first floor with the steady, predictable efficiency of a dog that had cleared hundreds of buildings. He was calm, focused, and followed every command as they moved through the kitchen and living room. Everything changed in the upstairs hallway. Rex suddenly stiffened up and began growling, locking on to a tall, completely still figure standing near the last door. The officer identified himself and ordered the figure to show their hands. There was no response. The figure simply turned and walked into the end bedroom, and the officer prepared to move in for an arrest. But Rex refused to move. In a total reversal of his training, the dog planted his feet and pulled backward on the leash, physically resisting the officer's attempts to enter that specific room. When the officer eventually forced his way inside, the room was empty. The window was locked from the inside, the closet was bare, and there were no hidden compartments. The person Rex had been barking at had simply vanished from a room with no exits. This is the trauma of the unexplainable. It undermines the 2 things a police officer relies on most: their own senses and the instinct of a trained partner. When biological reality contradicts physical evidence, it leaves a lingering doubt that procedure cannot fix. Another form of trauma arises from confronting extreme human darkness. A rookie officer once responded to a kidnapping call, where the victim's voice had been described by dispatch as sounding like a young girl, possibly through digital alteration. The officer arrived at an overgrown, dilapidated house during a total neighborhood blackout. The exterior neglect immediately signaled that this was an environment where the standard social rules of order had been abandoned. Inside, the home was a study in jarring contradictions. Piles of rotting garbage and cockroaches covered the floors. Yet the officer found a bedroom filled with neatly organized children's toys and meticulously folded women's clothing. In the corner of that room sat a human-sized doll, dressed in a blouse and jeans, staring back from a rocking chair. It was a grotesque, meticulously crafted centerpiece in a house otherwise defined by filth. The homeowner grew increasingly agitated as the officer moved toward the basement. Despite the man's desperate claims that nothing was down there, the officer pushed open the door and descended into a pitch-black room. There, they found the source of the 911 call. It was a 40-year-old man who had been missing for 2 years. He had been held in captivity in that basement for the entire duration of his disappearance. When the officer commanded the victim to come out, the man froze. He was so conditioned by fear that he remained motionless, terrified that the officer who had come to save him would mistake him for a threat and fire. The horror of this case lies in the realization of the sustained torture required to force a grown man into a child's voice just to survive. That sound, the childlike tone from a broken man, is what stays with an officer long after the arrest. The final pillar is the unresolved. In late October, an officer arrived at a silent house at 2:40 a.m. following reports of a woman's screams. There were no lights on, and the street was dead quiet. The front door was slightly ajar, yet the first floor was immaculate. There were no signs of a struggle in the kitchen or living room, creating a tense mismatch between the neighbor's report and the visual evidence. On the second floor, the officer found a pool of blood soaking into the carpet outside the bathroom. More blood was found streaked across the shower tiles, yet the room was empty. The officer discovered a hidden basement staircase behind a door near the kitchen. At the bottom sat a single metal chair with cut zip ties on the armrests, resting in a massive pool of fresh blood. As the officer swept the basement, a figure suddenly bolted from the darkness, shattered a small window, and escaped into the rain. By the time backup arrived and established a perimeter, the suspect was gone. The investigation only deepened the mystery. The blood belonged to the male homeowner, who was never found. No woman was ever identified at that address, leaving the neighbor's report of a female screaming entirely unexplained. The human mind naturally seeks closure, especially in investigative work. Living with this open loop, never knowing if a life was saved or if the suspect escaped to finish the job, creates a specific, recurring anxiety that few other calls can match. Eventually, the houses in these stories return to the market. The grass is mowed, the blood is cleaned, and new families move in, unaware of the histories buried within the walls. This cross-section shows the reality an officer carries. While the top half of the home remains idyllic and bright, the layers beneath the floorboards contain the abstract void of hidden trauma that the rest of the neighborhood never sees. These calls force a shift in how an officer views the world. They lose the ability to see a quiet street as merely peaceful, knowing that true darkness often hides in silence behind the most mundane front doors. The ultimate burden of the badge is the unshakable knowledge of what humans are capable of when the doors are locked. It is the weight of knowing that sometimes the most horrific things happen in the most normal places.